The image of a smiling man, arms outstretched, on stage at a technology conference, frozen. The smile is wide, genuine. His eyes are filled with a light that, in that photo, seemed inextinguishable. This is Alexander Vance. To the world, Alec was the embodiment of the modern American dream. A visionary. An empire builder. His life, meticulously curated on social media, was a mosaic of success. The luxury car in the garage of his modern home in the wealthy suburb of Austin, Texas. The vacations in Bora Bora with his wife and 2 daughters. The charity dinners where he was frequently honored. He had it all. Or, at least, everything money could buy. But there was something money couldn't buy, a vulnerability Alec had carried with him since his youth. A profound loneliness, an almost desperate longing for a true brotherly connection. A partner who was more than a partner. A brother in arms on the battlefield of business. This vulnerability, hidden beneath layers of confidence and achievement, would be the key that unlocked the door to his downfall. He built a fortune but yearned for a family. And in that yearning, he didn't realize he was digging his own grave with his own hands. If this story resonates with you, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is, because this isn't just a story about money disappearing. It's a story about trust being murdered. The seed of what would become Vance and Locke Ventures was planted not in a plush office, but in Alec's cramped garage. At 29, he had left a well-paying position at a large software company, driven by an idea that wouldn't let him sleep. Predictive logistics software that not only planned delivery routes but also anticipated supply chain bottlenecks with eerie accuracy. He called the prototype Logi Sync. It was brilliant, technically flawless. But Alec was, at heart, a creator, a build-array programming genius, but a relative newcomer to the murky complexities of raising venture capital, structuring a company, and negotiating with Silicon Valley bigwigs. He could code the solution to global supply chain problems, but he felt a knot in his stomach when he had to present his business to 5 investors in a room. For 2 years, Alec was a one-man show. He was the CEO, the chief engineer, the sales manager, and the intern. Nights turned to days in that garage, illuminated by the bluish glow of his monitors. He watched his college friends climb the ladder of traditional careers, buying their first homes, and a cruel doubt began to erode his confidence. Had he made the biggest mistake of his life? His wife, Sarah, was his rock. But even she couldn't fully understand the titanic pressure he'd placed on his own shoulders. He was building a castle, brick by brick, but he feared the foundation was made of sand. The turning point began with a tech trade show in San Francisco. Alec secured a modest booth, his business card, and a demo of Logi Sync running on a laptop. It was there that he met Michael Torres, a veteran angel investor with an eye for raw talent. Torres didn't invest immediately. But he did something more valuable. He looked at Alec, at the raw passion in his eyes, and then at the software and said, "You're a genius, kid. But you're alone. A gun needs a shooter. You need a Daniel Locke." The name echoed in Alec's mind for the next few weeks. Daniel Locke. He did some discreet research. Locke was a well-known, if not famous, figure in startup circles. Operator. One fixer, a man who didn't necessarily have his own ideas, but possessed a singular talent for taking someone else's idea and turning it into a money-making machine. He had worked for 3 startups, all of which sold profitably. It was said he could close a deal with a multinational before breakfast and structure a multi-million investment round before lunch. He was charismatic, eloquent, dressed in tailored suits that felt like a second skin. He was everything Alec wasn't. A week later, at Torres's insistence, Alec sent a formal email to Locke, enclosing an NDA and a brief introduction. The response came within 37 minutes. It wasn't an email. It was an invitation to lunch the next day at The Grill, an expensive restaurant Alec only knew by name. Lunch lasted 3.5 hours. Alec remembers every second. Locke arrived 5 minutes late, apologizing profusely with a firm handshake and a smile that seemed to light up the corner of the room. He didn't talk about money right away. He talked about vision. He asked deep questions about Logi Sync's algorithm, questions that showed he not only understood the technology, but also its disruptive potential. He talked about the market, about scalability, about building a legacy. And then, as dessert was served, Locke leaned forward and his voice lowered to an almost intimate tone. "Alec," he said, "what you've built all by yourself is incredible. But it's just the engine. You need the car around it. You need someone to drive that car to the top of the mountain. Let me be that someone. Let's build this, together." The word, together, hung in the air. To Alec it sounded like salvation. He was no longer alone. In that moment, in the heat of Daniel Locke's charisma, Vance and Locke Ventures was no longer a dream. was a destiny. And Alec, blinded by the promise of a true partnership, failed to see the first and most crucial warning sign: the ease with which Locke used the language of loyalty to disguise the architecture of betrayal. If Alexander Vance was the heart and brains of the operation, the genius behind the code that made the machine work, Daniel Locke was presented to the world, and, crucially to Alec, as its soul. He wasn't just a partner, he was the embodiment of the perfect complement. While Alec felt more comfortable in the shadows of his server room, Daniel was a stage animal, a maestro of perception. His official entry into Vance and Locke Ventures wasn't a mere hiring announcement. It was an event choreographed with the precision of an Apple product launch. It was Daniel who insisted on it. "We need to stake our claim, brother. Show the market that we're not just another startup. We're a day." The word brother fell from his lips with a naturalness that to Alec sounded like absolute truth, a tacit acknowledgement of the bond he so longed for. Daniel Locke was, at first glance, everything he promised. For the first 18 months he was a force of nature. He transformed Alec's pitch deck from a dense technical presentation into a gripping, irresistible narrative. He was the one who would close the office doors and force Alec to practice speeches for hours, refining every pause, every gesture. "They're not just buying the software, Alec. They're buying you. They are buying us." And it worked. The first seed round of funding of $500,000 closed in record time. The $3 million Series A came 6 months later, with a valuation that had the industry buzzing. Daniel didn't just bring the money, he brought an aura of invincible legitimacy. He hired a top-notch sales team, promising them profit sharing and a glorious future. He negotiated contracts with retail and logistics giants with a coolness and efficiency that left Alec amazed. "How did you do that?" Alec would ask incredulously after they closed a multimillion-dollar deal with a national chain. Daniel would shrug with an unassuming smile. "Just speak their language, brother. They don't want technology. They want profit. I just show them the way." It was during this period that the language of their partnership merged with that of their family. Dinners at Alec's house became a weekly occurrence. Daniel was the fun-loving uncle to Alec's 2 young girls, always arriving with extravagant gifts and wild tales of his travels. To Alec's wife, Sarah, he was a charming gentleman, always offering to help with the dishes after dinner, complimenting his cooking, and listening to her concerns about the stress Alec was carrying. He insinuated himself into their lives not as an employee or an associate, but as a beloved family member. Alec saw all this, and his gratitude transformed into unshakable trust. He had found not only the perfect partner, but the best friend he'd never had. On Sundays they began playing basketball on a public court. It was their sacred time, away from offices, investors, and pressures. And it was on one of those mornings, sweating and breathing deeply, that Daniel put his arm around Alec's shoulders and said, with unusual seriousness, "Brother, what's mine is yours. Always. We're building this together for our families. It's a pact." Alec held those words like a talisman. He couldn't have known he was witnessing the most elaborate and cruel of reenactments. At the office the dynamic was equally intense. Daniel took control of all non-technical operations with absolute authority. Finance, HR, sales, marketing, everything passed through his desk. He argued that Alec needed to be 100% focused on the product, on what he did best. "You're the goose that lays the golden eggs, buddy. I'll watch the coop. That's how a winning team plays." And indeed the results were spectacular. Growth was exponential. The team grew. They moved to a high-end office in downtown Austin, overlooking the Colorado River. The walls were adorned with industry awards and magazine articles praising the dynamic duo Vance and Locke. Daniel even commissioned a massive polished metal logo for the lobby, with the 2 names inextricably intertwined. To any outside observer, and certainly to Alec Vance, they were the model of a successful partnership. The synergy was palpable. The trust total. But hidden behind this facade of perfect collaboration, a solitary and meticulous operation had begun. While Alec worked late tweaking the LogiSync core, Daniel often worked even later, alone in his office, the door locked. He claimed to be closing deals with Asian or European time zones. No one questioned him. His dedication was legendary. But in those quiet hours he wasn't closing contracts for Vance and Locke. He was, piece by piece, building the escape network. He opened bank accounts in the names of shell LLCs, registered in tax havens with inflexible secrecy laws, Delaware, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland. He used a separate laptop, not connected to the company network, a clean device he carried in a messenger bag and never left out of sight. He studied Alec's weakness, his complete disregard for the boring stuff of finance and accounting, and turned it into his greatest weapon. With every big deal he closed, a small percentage was siphoned off, diverted through a maze of entities created to appear as legitimate suppliers: consulting services, software licensing fees, data acquisition. Alec's system was perfect for anticipating logistical bottlenecks. Daniel's system was perfect for creating one. A bottleneck of money, flowing silently away from the company's coffers and straight into the pockets of the man Alec called brother. The partnership was indeed a masterpiece. Only Alec was the only one unaware that he was playing a role in his own tragedy. Under Daniel Locke's leadership, Vance and Locke Ventures didn't grow, it exploded. What began as a promising engine in a garage transformed, in less than 36 months, into a rampant financial locomotive, a symbol of rapid and profitable success in the Austin startup scene. The trade press loved a good story, and theirs was irresistible: the reclusive technical genius and the charismatic sales star, a pair of business brothers who seemed to have discovered the alchemical secret to turning code into gold. The money machine, as it was dubbed on a magazine cover, seemed to operate with almost frightening efficiency. LogiSync was no longer a product, it was an industry standard. The influx of capital was overwhelming. After the successful Series A, Daniel led the charge for a Series B round that raised even the most hardened investors' eyebrows. They raised $15 million with a post-money valuation of nearly $100 million. The money flowed into the company's checking account like a rising tide. With it came a new level of corporate luxury. The office was expanded to 2 entire floors, decorated by a renowned interior designer with exorbitantly priced minimalist furniture and modern art worth more than Alec's childhood home. There was an in-house chef preparing gourmet meals, pool tables, and a full bar with a part-time sommelier. Daniel justified every penny. "Perception is reality, Alec," he would say, pouring an expensive whiskey for a potential client in one of the many smoked glass conference rooms. "When they see this, they don't see expense. They see success. They see stability. They want to be a part of it." And unfortunately he was right. The show worked. 7- and 8-figure contracts were signed with routine frequency. For Alec Vance, that period was a dizzying dream. He was living the life he'd always imagined but never truly believed possible. Financial success was tangible. He paid off Sarah's mortgage, put his daughters in the best private schools, and bought that Porsche 911 he'd secretly admired in magazines. But more than the money was the sense of accomplishment, of validation. The press called him a visionary. His parents, once worried about his risky career choice, now bragged to their friends. He attributed everything to Daniel. In every speech, in every interview, he always included the same line: "None of this would be possible without my brother, Daniel Locke. He's the architect of it all." The trust he placed in Daniel was absolute, blind, and total. When the board of directors was formed, Alec didn't even read the minutes of the meeting that officially granted Daniel sole control over all the company's financial decisions, including the authority to sign checks and transfer funds up to an astronomical amount without a second signature. Why would he read it? Daniel was his brother. Their pact was stronger than any piece of paper. While Alec focused on scaling the technology, managing his expanding engineering team, and ensuring the product remained the best in the market, Daniel navigated the financial world with a dexterity that seemed magical. He presented financial reports at board meetings that showed healthy profit margins, steady revenue growth, and a clear path to profitability. The charts were beautiful, the projections brilliant. Investors applauded. Alec sat proudly beside him, asking no questions. He didn't see what was behind the numbers. He didn't see that the profits were, in part, investors' own capital being recycled and presented as revenue. He didn't see that the vendors receiving huge payments for implementation consulting services, or exclusive intellectual property licensing fees, were, in fact, empty shells, shell companies registered with obscure accounting firms and tax havens, all controlled by a single person, Daniel Locke. The company's fortune was, therefore, a fortress with a catastrophic flaw in its foundation. It seemed impenetrable from the outside. The walls were high, the financial cannons pointed skyward, and the flag of success flew proudly. But the only key to the main gate was in the pocket of a man who was slowly, silently undermining the foundations. Money flowed in, yes, but a steady and growing portion flowed out, through a secret tunnel Daniel meticulously dug in the basement. The money-making machine was actually 2 machines. One visible and noisy that generated wealth and success, another silent and invisible that sucked that wealth and channeled it into a trace-proof hiding place. And Alec, the man who built the engine of the entire operation, was so fascinated by the smoke and mirrors of Daniel's spectacle that he never asked himself what truly fueled that fire. Even the most successful empires, those that seem carved from granite, begin to crumble with a single thread of doubt. A whisper. A barely perceptible scratch on the immaculate paint. For Vance and Locke Ventures, that whisper came in the form of a young accounting intern named Chloe Ribeiro. It was her first summer at the firm, and she had been assigned a monotonous task: cross-checking supplier invoices against authorized payments in the system, a basic reconciliation that no one else wanted to do. It was during this low-level audit that her eye, trained in forensic accounting classes, landed on a line that simply didn't make sense. The transaction was for Ether Consulting LLC. The amount, $48,500. The concept, third-party API integration fees. Chloe frowned. She knew the LogiSync system almost as well as the engineers, and one of its biggest competitive advantages was that it was a closed ecosystem. It didn't rely on expensive third-party APIs. Intrigued, she dug deeper. Ether Consulting had no website. Its listed address was a post office box in Wilmington, Delaware, a known hotbed for shell companies. The phone number led to a full post office box. And the strangest thing, the invoice was extremely generic with no details of hours worked, employee names, or any specific scope of work. It was simply a note demanding payment. With her heart beating a little faster, a chill on the back of her neck unrelated to the office's air conditioning, Chloe walked over to her supervisor, Ben, the company's financial controller. She showed him the invoice and her findings. Ben, a man in his 50s who had been hired by Daniel Locke himself, glanced at the screen, then at the eager intern, and let out a short laugh. "Oh, Ether. Yeah. I forgot to tell you about that one. It's one of those niche consulting firms. Daniel handles them himself. It's a high-level deal. Corporate strategy stuff. You don't need to worry about that." The explanation was delivered with a matter-of-factness that should have been reassuring. But something about the haste with which Ben dismissed her concerns, the way his eyes shifted from her to the screen, rang false to Chloe. Corporate strategy wasn't a line item. It was a place to hide. She tried to forget. She tried to convince herself that Ben knew what he was talking about. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, almost unconsciously, she began to notice other patterns. There was a constellation of similar vendors: Pangea Data Solutions, Nimbus Rights Management, Obelisk Capital Advisors. All with addresses in Delaware or the Cayman Islands. All with vague invoices. All with payments authorized by a single digital signature, D. Locke. The amounts ranged from $20,000 to nearly $200,000. And whenever a larger payment was made to one of these vendors, an equally large customer contract was signed, justifying the cash flow. It was like perfect choreography. Brave, or perhaps naive, Chloe decided to bypass Ben. She scheduled a quick 15-minute meeting with Vance himself, using the pretext of being impressed with the company culture and wanting to better understand the founder's vision. When she sat down at Alec's desk, her nervousness was palpable. She praised his work and then hesitantly mentioned that in her reconciliation she had noticed some minor discrepancies with some vendors and asked if he could clarify the strategic nature of that work. She mentioned the name Ether Consulting. Alec's reaction wasn't what she expected. He looked genuinely perplexed. "Ether? Never heard of it," he said, swiveling in his chair. "That must be Daniel's thing. He handles all that side of the operation. He's the finance wizard." He smiled, a smile of complete confidence. "But it's good to see you're so detail-oriented, Chloe. That's a great quality." He didn't see a red flag, he saw an ambitious intern. Before she could elaborate, he glanced at his watch. "I have a product meeting in 2 minutes. But talk to Daniel about it. He'll love explaining the strategy behind it. He's great at mentoring." Chloe left the room feeling foolish. The founder himself wasn't worried. Who was she, an intern, to question the well-oiled machine that was Vance and Locke? Later that day, however, she received an email from Daniel Locke. The subject line was, "Good eye." The tone was avuncular, friendly. He thanked her for her diligent work and invited her for a quick chat. When she entered his office, he was standing, looking out the window, and turned with a broad smile. "Chloe, come in. Have a seat." He explained Ether Consulting in fluid, convincing jargon. He talked about synergistic partnerships, confidential revenue-sharing agreements, and protecting intellectual property in a competitive marketplace. His words were a fog of corporate jargon that sounded important but meant nothing concrete. Sometimes we need to channel funds through discrete channels to protect our competitive advantage, you know, he said, winking at her. It's a high-level game of chess. He then praised her acumen again and offered her a full-time paid internship after graduation. The message was clear: you're smart and we'll reward you for your loyalty. Stop digging. Chloe's doubt was not only explained but bought. The first whisper was drowned out by the seductive sound of success and the promise of belonging. She left Daniel's office feeling special, seen, part of the inner circle. She never mentioned Ether Consulting or any of the other shadow vendors to anyone again. The whisper had died. And her silence was the first wall of Daniel Locke's escape tunnel successfully sealed. Chloe Ribeiro's silence was the final piece of the puzzle Daniel Locke needed. He hadn't just neutralized a potential threat, he had recruited her. That episode confirmed his deepest suspicion: the system he'd built was perfect. The company was such a well-tuned organism, so blinded by its own culture of success and confidence, that its natural defense mechanisms had been deactivated. Any anomaly that emerged would be treated not as a threat, but as noise to be drowned out by the narrative of uninterrupted success. He was free to operate in the open, hidden in plain sight. The labyrinth of phantom entities was no longer a secret project. It was an operational, albeit invisible, part of the business. Daniel's modus operandi was a study in calculated audacity. He wasn't content to reactively embezzle funds. He would create a fictitious need and then fulfill it with one of his own shell companies. When Vance and Locke closed a large contract with a new multinational retailer, for example, Daniel would immediately approve a one-time integration fee paid to Pangea Data Solutions, one of his shell LLCs, claiming it was necessary to connect the new client to its legacy infrastructure. The amount, always a percentage of the contract, seemed reasonable within the context of the massive deal. No one questioned it. After all, Daniel had closed the deal. Who better to know the costs involved? Each of his entities had a specific function, a made-up specialty that sounded plausible to the untrained eye. Nimbus Rights Management handled software licensing and intellectual property fees for international markets. Obelisk Capital Advisors provided strategic M&A consulting. A cruel joke, considering Daniel was effectively conducting a hostile takeover of his own company. Ether Consulting, the one that nearly escaped his control, was his favorite for special confidential R&D projects. He built a complete parasitic ecosystem, where his shell companies fed off the success of the host company. The real stroke of genius, however, was in the money's logistics. Daniel never transferred funds directly to a personal account. He was a master of layering, a money laundering technique. Payments from Vance and Locke to, say, Obelisk Capital Advisors, would go to a corporate account in the Cayman Islands. From there, the money would be immediately transferred to a private account. Other a shell company in Luxembourg, controlled by him under a different name. From this account, part of the money was sent to a private investment fund in Singapore, known for its absolute secrecy, and another part was converted into cryptocurrency through an obscure exchange. The paper trail began in Austin and ended abruptly in a digital black hole somewhere in the cyber world, impossible to trace without an international court order, something he knew no one at the company would have the motive or ability to obtain. He ran this shadowy empire with iron discipline. He used only a clean laptop, connected to the internet via prepaid mobile networks, never via company Wi-Fi. All communication with the representatives of his shell companies, all of whom he himself represented using disposable voice-over IP numbers and distinct accents, took place outside of business hours. He kept a meticulous and public calendar of meetings and appointments, creating a perfect alibi for every moment he spent fueling his scheme. He was a ghost managing ghosts, a two-way mirror where his public image as a loyal and dedicated partner perfectly reflected his private image as the architect of a monumental escape. The amount he embezzled, the $15 million that would give this tragedy its title, wasn't a single loot. It was a slow, steady drain, an almost homeopathic bleeding that lasted 3 years. There were hundreds of transactions, none large enough to trigger automatic alarms in the banking systems, but all adding up to a colossal fortune. He wasn't stealing, he was paying himself a side bonus, an obscene salary for his role as the company's top predator. And all of this was done under the nose of Alec Vance, who continued to see him as a brother, a partner, the faithful keeper of the henhouse. The maze wasn't just one of paper companies and offshore bank accounts. It was a maze of perception, and Daniel Locke had locked Alec Vance right in the center of it, blind and satisfied, while he silently dismantled the walls around him. Alexander Vance's world fell apart not with a bang but with silence. It was an ordinary Tuesday, sunny and warm in Austin. Alec had arrived at the office early, energized. They were about to close the largest contract in their history, a global partnership with a logistics giant that would put LogiSync in every corner of the planet. He needed the finalized revenue projection figures for a final board meeting that afternoon. He walked to Daniel's office to get them. The door was closed, which was unusual for that hour. He knocked lightly. No answer. He tried the doorknob. Locked. A tiny chill, a sliver of ice, penetrated his confidence. Maybe Daniel was sick. He sent a text message. "Brother, how are you? I need those numbers for the 3 o'clock meeting." The message showed as delivered but not as read. The ice grew a bit. He went to Daniel's assistant, Maya. "Did you see Daniel today?" Maya looked confused. "No, he hasn't come yet. And he hasn't scheduled anything on his calendar. It's weird, he always lets me know if he's going to be late." The next few hours were a slow, agonizing process of growing despair. The 3 p.m. meeting was canceled. Alec tried calling Daniel's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. A deep unease began to take hold of him. He called Ben, the financial controller. "Ben, have you spoken to Daniel today? We need to authorize the last transfer for the world largest contract." Ben stared at his screen, his face pale. "Alec, about that. The system isn't letting me approve it. It says the primary signature for transactions over 1 million is invalid. That doesn't make sense." Then the first email arrived. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from one of the Series B investors, a man named Carl Hammond, known for his fiery temper. The subject line was, "Urgent. Explain this immediately." The body of the email was blunt. "Alec, I just received notice from my bank that a scheduled dividend payment from VNL has been canceled due to insufficient funds. What's going on there?" Alec's blood seemed to freeze. Insufficient funds? It was impossible. They had millions in cash. He rushed to the server room, his mind denying what his instincts were already screaming. Ignoring all protocols, he accessed the main financial server directly, something he hadn't done in years. His hands trembled on the keyboard. He pulled up the balance of the main operating accounts. The numbers on the screen made no sense. Where there should have been a hefty balance of tens of millions, there was only enough to cover that week's payroll. He thought it was a cache error, a bug. He refreshed the page. The numbers remained the same. A high-pitched buzzing filled his ears. His vision narrowed. He opened the transaction history, filtering the last 90 days. His mind, trained to find patterns in lines of code, now saw a horrifying pattern in lines of financial data. Transfers. Dozens of them. To Ether Consulting. To Pangea Data. To Nimbus Rights. All authorized by D. Locke. The amounts made him feel sick. $200,000. $475,000. $150,000. One after the other. Like an ominous melody. He opened a tab and frantically searched for Ether Consulting LLC. The first result was from a corporate database website. Registered agent. A legal services firm in Wilmington. Owners/managers. Confidential information. He staggered back, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. "Brother? What's mine is yours." Daniel's words on the basketball court echoed in his mind, now not as a pact but as a curse. He leaned against the cold wall of the servery, sweat dripping down his temples. He picked up his cell phone with barely responsive fingers and dialed Daniel's number again. This time the call didn't go to voicemail. An automated recording, impersonal and cold, answered, "The number you dialed is not in service. Please check the number and try again." That was the sound of the world collapsing. The sound of a vacuum. The sound of $15 million and a friendship he believed unbreakable evaporating into thin air, leaving behind only the deafening silence of absolute betrayal. He slid down the wall to the floor, the phone slipping from his limp hand. There, on the cold floor of the server room, surrounded by the digital brains of the company he built, Alexander Vance, the visionary, the tycoon, the brother, realized he was completely alone. And broke. The cold floor of the server room against Alec Vance's back was the only tangible anchor in a universe that had collapsed into pure digital abstraction. The betrayal wasn't a punch in the gut. It was a black hole that had opened beneath his feet, sucking in all light, sound, and air. Slowly, a primal instinct for survival began to replace the paralyzing shock. He stood, legs shaking, and walked back to his desk. He was no longer a CEO. He was an investigator cursed to sift through the digital wreckage of his own life. His first call was to Sarah. His voice, when he managed to force the words out, sounded unrecognizable to his own ears, raspy, broken, otherworldly. Something horrible has happened. Daniel, the money is gone. He couldn't elaborate. The second call was to his lawyer, Mark, a pragmatic man whose tone instantly changed from professional courtesy to restrained alarm when he heard the fragility in Alec's voice. Don't touch anything else. Don't send emails. I'm on my way. Call the police. Now. The once vibrant offices of Vance and Locke Ventures were transformed into a crime scene without the yellow ribbon. Two fraud detectives from the Austin Police Department arrived with a silent, grave presence. They weren't using sirens. Their debacle merited no public urgency. Only a private, colossal shame. As Alec, pale and trembling, told the story, the partnership, the trust, the shell companies, the detectives exchanged glances. They had heard variations of this story before, but never on such a monumental scale and with such an intimate violation of trust. The actual digital forensics investigation began the next morning, led by a cybercrime firm Mark had hired. They were methodical, impersonal, like surgeons entering an operating room. The image that emerged from Daniel's laptop, confiscated from his desk, which he of course had left behind clean as a slate, was that of a ghost. The browsing history was that of a model executive. No suspicious files. No compromising emails. The computer was a perfect mask. The truth lay hidden deep within the company's servers. Forensic investigators, with the help of a traumatized but technically brilliant Alec, began to reconstruct Daniel's maze piece by piece. They uncovered the digital breadcrumbs he had left behind, not through carelessness, but through the very nature of the transactions. Each transfer to Ether or Pangea had an authorization number, a timestamp, an IP address from which the order had been signed. And that was when the true horror, the almost artistic meticulousness of the betrayal, revealed itself. The IP addresses didn't point to the company's Wi-Fi network or the office broadband connection. They pointed to a series of prepaid mobile routers, purchased with cash from electronic stores in different states over the past 2 years. The time of the transactions, always between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m., or between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. Daniel wasn't stealing during work hours. He was stealing before getting his breakfast and after putting his daughters to bed. He had made stealing a routine. Alec, looking at the timeline the researchers had constructed, felt a fresh wave of nausea. He remembered so many of those days. Daniel's email at 5:17 a.m. Brother, I can't wait to attack the day. Meet you at the office. As he wrote this, he was likely sitting in his home office, authorizing the transfer of $200,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands. The double life wasn't just factual, it was timed with psychopathic precision. Investigators tracked the final recipients of the transfers. Vance and Locke's money arrived in shell company accounts and then sped off in a dozen different directions within hours. Private equity funds in Singapore, brokerage accounts in Switzerland, and, the final modern twist, massive conversions to cryptocurrency through exchanges with notoriously lax know-your-customer policies. Each layer was a new wall, higher and thicker than the last. The maze wasn't just to hide the money, it was to make recovery so slow, so expensive, and so internationally complex that it would be virtually impossible. Daniel Locke hadn't simply fled with the money. He had built a digital fortress around it, brick by brick, with the patience of a master craftsman, using his best friend's trust as mortar. The investigation then entered its most frustrating and visceral phase, the manhunt. While forensic experts mapped the digital money trail, detectives and private investigators had to figure out what had happened to Daniel Locke himself. The image that emerged was that of a ghost who meticulously dissipated into thin air, leaving behind nothing more substantial than a handful of dust and the echo of his own lies. The last person Daniel Locke saw was Maya, his assistant, on Monday afternoon. He left the office at 5:30 p.m. as usual, with an easy smile and a, "See you tomorrow, Maya. Get the paperwork ready for World Logist, it's going to be a big day." He was carrying his usual brown leather briefcase and the black messenger bag that held his personal laptop. Nothing in his demeanor suggested he wouldn't return. Security cameras in the office parking lot captured him getting into his black Range Rover and driving off toward his home in the upscale Terrytown neighborhood. That was the last unequivocal record of his existence. Traffic cameras along his usual route home captured him at points, but the trail went cold near his condo. The Range Rover was found Tuesday morning, parked perfectly in his driveway. The key was in the ignition. Inside the car, investigators found nothing. No gas receipts, no parking tickets, not a shred of evidence. The vehicle had been cleaned with professional meticulousness. Inside the house, the scene was equally surreal. Daniel Locke's residence was less a house and more a setting for a design magazine. Everything was immaculate but soulless. There were no framed personal photographs, no letters on the table, no clothes out of place. The master bedroom closet was missing a few clothes, enough to fill a medium-sized suitcase. The bathroom was missing a toothbrush. The trash had been emptied. He didn't flee in panic, he packed with care and precision. The big clue, the one everyone was waiting for, was his cell phone. The location of the last cell tower ping was traced to Austin Bergstrom International Airport on Monday night, around 8:30 p.m. An initial wave of hope swept the investigation team. They combed the passenger manifests of all domestic and international flights departing that night and Tuesday morning. No Daniel Locke was listed. They expanded the search to include similar names, connecting flights, private flights. Nothing. He didn't use his real identity. He was too smart for that. They then turned to the airport security cameras, a Herculean task that took days. Hundreds of hours of footage were reviewed. And then they saw him. A man wearing a low-brimmed baseball cap and a light coat despite the Austin heat, carrying only a black backpack. He moved with deliberate calm, unhurried, blending into the crowd. He never looked directly at any camera. At one point he stopped at a gift shop and bought a pair of headphones with cash. The cashier didn't remember him. The man passed through security and disappeared into the terminal's concourses. He never boarded a plane, at least not one that required passing through the main boarding gate. The leading theory is that he may have accessed a private aviation hangar, where surveillance is less extensive and passenger records are much more discreet, or even non-existent for certain types of flights. Daniel Locke's last digital breath was a transaction. While Alex still lay unconscious on the server room floor on Tuesday morning, one final transfer was authorized. $75,000 from the Vance and Locke trading account to Obelisk Capital Advisors. It was digitally signed at 9:05 a.m. The IP address was traced to a cafe with free Wi-Fi at the airport. The transaction was made from a device that was never used again. It was his final dagger. A final, cruel insult, delivered from the airport, showing he wasn't hiding in fear. He was in complete control right up until the last second. And then he simply vanished. The ghost in the machine shut down, leaving behind only silence and a trail of digital destruction leading nowhere. The money was gone. Daniel was gone. And in the colossal vacuum they left behind, only Alexander Vance remained. But the Alec who emerged from the rubble was not the same man. The confident visionary, the proud family man, the loyal partner, had been erased. In his place was a stranger, a haunted man, carrying a weight that was not just financial but existential. Daniel Locke's betrayal wasn't a robbery, it was an emotional dissection. He didn't just take $15 million. He took Alex's identity. The days turned into a bureaucratic and legal nightmare. Vance and Locke Ventures, once a shooting star, was immediately placed in Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The luxurious offices were emptied, the expensive furniture auctioned off for pennies. The team of 60 employees, many of them friends, was fired in a single torturous meeting where Alec, his voice cracking, had to explain the inexplicable. The shame was a taste of ash in his mouth. Investors sued. Carl Hammond, the first to sound the alarm, filed a personal lawsuit against Alec for negligent management and fraud. The word fraud hit him like a punch. He wasn't the criminal, he was the victim. But in the cutthroat world of finance, the line between them can become dangerously thin. His personal life crumbled under the stress. Nights were the worst. He lay next to Sarah, but he was a million miles away, spinning in the maze of his own mind, replaying every interaction, every moment, every sign he ignored. "Brother, what's mine is yours." The phrase now echoed in his ears not as a pact, but as a sinister mockery. He began to see Daniel's shadow in every corner. A man wearing a cap in a shopping mall made his heart race. The ringing of a phone made him jump. He was diagnosed with severe anxiety and insomnia. Therapy helped, but it couldn't erase the fundamental scar. He had been a fool. A fool who trusted blindly and, because of that trust, destroyed not only his own dream but the dreams of dozens of others. Sarah tried to be strong, tried to hold on, but the pressure was too great. The house he had paid for, the symbol of his success, was now a financial anchor. They could no longer afford it. They sold it at a significant loss and moved to a smaller rented apartment. The girls, too young to understand the complexity of the situation, felt the constant tension, the palpable sadness that hung over their father. He no longer walked them to school singing, no longer threw them into the air in the living room. He was physically present but emotionally absent, a ghost in his own family. The light Sarah had once seen in his eyes, that spark of creator, of builder, had faded, replaced by a cautious, aching emptiness. The greatest scar, however, was the most intimate, the inability to trust. How do you trust the world again when the person you called brother meticulously engineered your destruction? How do you form a new partnership? How do you even look a new employee in the eye without wondering if they, too, are building a maze? Alec Vance became a besieged fortress, his drawbridges permanently raised. He found work as an IT consultant, a step above a junior employee, using his skills to fix other people's systems, never again to build his own. It was a job, not a career. A way to pay the bills, not to fulfill a dream. The grieving process was for everything he had lost, his company, his money, his reputation. But most of all, it was for the man he thought he knew, and the man he himself used to be. The financial betrayal could, in time, be overcome. The betrayal of trust, however, left a wound that would not heal. He was a man rich in nothing, surrounded by the ghostly memories of what had been and what could have been, forever trapped on the day he discovered that the brother he had chosen was, in fact, the most elaborate and expensive nightmare of his life. Years passed. The case of Alexander Vance versus the ghost of Daniel Locke grew cold in the police department's files, relegated to the cold case pile, those mysteries that time and a lack of new leads failed to solve. But for Alec and for the few tenacious investigators and online true crime forums that feed on such stories, the case remained open, a wound that never fully healed. The question echoes, a persistent whisper in the dark corners of the internet and in Alec's mind during his sleepless nights. Where is Daniel Locke? Theories are many and varied, each reflecting a different aspect of the nightmare. The most popular theory, and the most terrifying for Alec, is that of the criminal mastermind. In this narrative, Daniel Locke is not a fugitive, but a triumphant. He is living a life of unimaginable luxury in a paradise without extradition treaties, a secluded villa in Dubai, an apartment overlooking the Red Sea in Oman, or a private island in the Caribbean. He has surgically altered his appearance, acquired a new identity with a golden passport through some shady investment program, and now lives as a high-class ghost, managing his stolen fortune from behind the scenes, perhaps even orchestrating new scams from a safe distance. He has the last laugh, watching from afar the ruin of those he betrayed, his escape the ultimate masterpiece of a life dedicated to illusion. The second, darker theory is that of the eliminated. It suggests that Daniel Locke was himself a pawn in a much larger game. Perhaps he was laundering money for someone more powerful, a criminal organization, a corrupt conglomerate, and when the scheme reached a critical scale he became a liability. His perfect escape was, in fact, a perfectly orchestrated execution. His body would have been in a landfill on another continent, or at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, and the money he stole would have simply returned to its original owners, cleaner and untraceable. This theory offers a morbid, but no less terrifying, conclusion. And there is a third theory, the most cruel of all for its banality, the zombie theory. It proposes that Daniel Locke is not living the life of a king, but a mediocre, vigilante existence. That he is in a second or third world country, in Argentina, Indonesia, or Slovenia, living in moderation, always looking over his shoulder, paranoid, unable to spend his fortune significantly without attracting attention. He would be a prisoner of his own wealth, a rich man who cannot buy a past or a future, only an endless, monotonous present of fearful anonymity. For Alec, this is perhaps the worst punishment imaginable for Daniel. Not death or prison, but eternal boredom and constant fear. Occasionally, warnings surface. A private investigator, paid with Alec's last-ditch money, thought he'd spotted a man with Daniel's facial structure in a CCTV image from a Macau casino. Another false lead put him on a spiritual retreat in India. None of these led anywhere. They only reopened wounds and further depleted Alec's resources. The search for Daniel Locke has become Alec Vance's very reason for living. He's no longer trying to get the money back. He knows that's impossible. He's searching for answers. He needs to look into the eyes of the man he called brother and ask a single question: why? He needs to understand if those years of friendship, those family dinners, those Sundays playing basketball, if any of it was real. Or if he was just a useful character in a play written by a sociopath. The lack of closure is a constant torture. Daniel Locke is no longer a man, he's an echo. A ghost that haunts not a place but a life. And until Alec finds the body or the man, he will be condemned to wander the corridors of his own past, eternally haunted by the ghostly smile of the brother who vanished, not just with millions, but with Alec's very ability to believe in another person. The echo never ceases. And the question remains, hanging in the air, not just for Alec but for everyone who hears this story: where on earth is Daniel Locke? The search for Daniel Locke has become a shadow of the very life Vance now leads. He's moved to a smaller apartment, far from the upscale neighborhoods that once symbolized his success. The walls are bare except for a single painting, a framed photo of him and Daniel taken at the first company retreat, arms linked, smiling into a camera that couldn't see the gulf that opened between them. Alec looks at it not with longing, but with forensic intensity, as if studying the image could decipher the exact moment the mask slipped, revealing the emptiness behind his brother's eyes. He receives occasional emails from Chloe Ribeiro, the intern who nearly uncovered everything. She now works in financial compliance, specializing in fraud detection. She writes to him whenever she hears of a new scam, a new pattern of embezzlement that vaguely resembles Daniel's meticulous hand. They're always dead ends. Daniel was unique. An artist who painted his masterpiece and then disappeared, leaving a signature but no trace. The cruel, final truth that Alec is forced to confront every morning upon waking is that Daniel Locke may never be found. He may be dead. Or alive and thriving. Or alive and miserable. Uncertainty is his true prison. Justice, if it exists at all, will not come with handcuffs and a trial. It resides in the permanent scar Daniel will bear, whether as a lonely rich man in a gilded paradise, or as a common fugitive in a cheap hotel room, jumping at every knock on the door. He will forever be a man who cannot use his own name, who cannot contact anyone he has ever known, who cannot build anything real. His fortune is a cage. And Alec? Alec is learning to live with the ghost. He doesn't trust easily. He reads every contract with a magnifying glass of suspicion. He will never call anyone brother again. But he still breathes. He still stands. He still helps his youngest daughter with her math homework. The betrayal defined him, but it didn't destroy him completely. He was broken and mended, and the cracks are still visible, but he is whole. The story of Alexander Vance and Daniel Locke isn't a solvable mystery. It's a case study. A warning. A mirror held up to a world obsessed with quick success and legendary partnerships. It questions how well we truly know those with whom we share our tables, our dreams, our lives. It whispers that the real danger is never outside trying to invade. It's inside, serving the coffee, closing the deal, calling you brother. And then one morning it disappears. And takes everything with it. So, the next time you blindly trust a business partner, someone who promises the world with a handshake and a perfect smile, remember the name Daniel Locke. Remember that some ghosts don't haunt old houses. They haunt bank accounts. They haunt broken hearts. And they are never ever found.